We are living in a culture that treats constant output as proof of worth, and stillness as something suspicious. If you turn down plans after an exhausting week, if you let an entire afternoon pass without checking anything off a list, you may quietly feel like something is wrong with you. The whispers arrive fast, calling this laziness, calling it a lack of drive, calling it a problem that needs fixing immediately. But what if that pull toward doing nothing is not a flaw at all, but one of the most intelligent signals your mind can send you? From Carl Jung's perspective, the urge to stop moving is not a step backward, but often the beginning of something far deeper unfolding inside a person. In this space of doing nothing, a person is not falling apart, but quietly preparing for a different kind of growth. Today's video is not asking you to abandon your goals or give up on effort altogether in life. It is simply inviting you to notice that stopping, in the right moment, might be the wisest choice you make for yourself all week. Number 1, doing nothing helps us detach from the performance of constant productivity. Doing nothing is rarely just about stopping physical movement for a few hours in a day. It is about stepping into a space where you no longer need to prove your value through visible output of any kind. Most people have learned, often without noticing, that their worth gets measured by how much they accomplish within a single day. A quiet afternoon with nothing finished can start to feel like evidence that something about the day went wrong. This feeling rarely comes from logic, since rest is something every living creature genuinely needs to function. Instead, it comes from a mask people wear even when nobody else is watching them closely. Carl Jung described this mask as the persona, the version of ourselves shaped by what others expect us to become. He wrote that the persona is what one is not, but what oneself and others believe one to be. Most people apply this idea only to social behavior, to the way we act politely around coworkers or strangers. But there is another version of this same mask that many people wear even in complete privacy, alone. This is the productive person mask, the quiet performance of always being useful, always improving, always moving toward something bigger. It shows up when someone feels guilty for reading a book that offers no clear practical benefit or lesson. It shows up when a walk outside must be tracked, measured, and turned into progress toward a fitness goal. It shows up when relaxing itself becomes another task, complete with rules about how correctly one should be resting. This mask convinces a person that stillness is only acceptable if it eventually leads somewhere useful and measurable. Think about the ancient story of Sisyphus, a figure condemned to push a heavy boulder up a mountain forever without end. Every time he neared the top, the boulder would roll back down, forcing him to begin the exhausting climb again. This myth is often used to describe meaningless labor, work that never truly finishes or produces lasting satisfaction. But there is another detail worth noticing carefully, something the myth reveals about all mythic figures across many old cultures. Even the greatest heroes in mythology are never shown performing heroic tasks endlessly without any pause between them. Every hero eventually returns to rest, to reflect, to simply exist without needing to prove anything through action. A hero who never stops moving is not admired in these stories, but is instead shown as trapped, exactly like Sisyphus himself. The absence of rest in these myths is never portrayed as strength, but almost always as a form of punishment. Modern psychological research supports this ancient wisdom in ways that feel surprisingly practical for everyday life. Constant self-monitoring, the habit of tracking steps, screen time, productivity scores, and daily achievements consumes real cognitive energy. This mental effort works in a way that closely resembles the exhaustion caused by performing social roles for other people all day. Just as constantly adjusting your tone and behavior around others drains psychological resources over time,
Часть 2.
so does constantly measuring your own worth through output. The mind cannot easily distinguish between performing for an audience of coworkers and performing for an audience made only of yourself. Both forms of performance activate the same underlying alertness, the same subtle tension of always needing to look acceptable and productive. Over time, this creates a specific kind of fatigue that many people struggle to explain clearly to others. They are not physically tired in an obvious way, yet something inside them feels quietly depleted and unable to rest properly. This happens because true rest requires the complete absence of evaluation, even evaluation coming only from oneself. Let me tell you about a woman from our community who wrote in after watching one of our earlier videos on stillness. She explained that she had always finished her to-do lists early, always optimized her schedule down to the smallest detail of her day. Every hour had a purpose, every free moment had a plan attached to it, even her weekends were structured around personal improvement goals. One day, without any clear reason, she decided to stop making lists completely, just to see what would happen next. The first feeling that arrived was not relief at all, but a heavy, uncomfortable wave of guilt washing over her. She kept checking her phone, expecting a task to remind her of, expecting something urgent she had forgotten to handle. Hours passed with nothing accomplished in any visible or measurable way that she could point to later. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the guilt began to soften into something unfamiliar, something closer to quiet relief settling into her chest. She later described this moment as the first time in years she felt like a person instead of a task list. Her story is not unusual at all, and many people quietly recognize themselves inside a similar experience. This mask of constant productivity does not appear because a person is shallow or obsessed with appearances or simply vain. It appears because modern life consistently rewards visible output while treating quiet stillness as something suspicious or wasted entirely. Children are praised for busy schedules filled with activities, and adults are praised for packed calendars and constant availability. Very few people are ever taught that doing absolutely nothing can also be a form of genuine self-respect. Removing this mask, even briefly, requires tolerating an uncomfortable stretch of time where nothing visible happens at all. It requires sitting with the guilt long enough for it to pass, without immediately reaching for a new task to silence it. Many people give up during this uncomfortable stretch, filling the emptiness again before they ever reach the relief waiting quietly on the other side. But those who stay a little longer often discover, just like the woman in our story, that nothing bad actually happens. If any part of this section feels familiar to you right now, if you recognize this exhaustion of always needing to be doing something, I want to hear from you. Simply type the word enough in the comments below this video today. Not because I need proof that you are watching, but because naming this exhaustion out loud is often the very first step toward loosening its grip. You may be surprised how many other people leave the exact same word underneath your comment. This mask, once acknowledged clearly, does not disappear immediately through simple willpower or a single decision. It loosens slowly, through repeated moments of choosing stillness even when guilt tries to pull you back into constant motion. Once this productivity mask finally begins to come off, even for a short while, something unexpected tends to happen underneath it. The silence that follows is rarely as peaceful as most people imagine it will feel in advance. Instead, other things begin quietly surfacing, things that constant busyness had been successfully burying for a very long time. Fatigue that was never fully acknowledged starts rising slowly toward the surface of conscious awareness. Old frustrations that were pushed aside for the sake of staying productive begin asking quietly to be noticed. Chest 3. This is not a sign that removing the mask was a mistake, or that something has gone wrong inside a person. It is simply the next honest layer of the self, waiting patiently underneath years of constant, visible motion. And this layer, uncomfortable as it may feel at first, deserves its own careful attention next. Stillness rarely brings instant peace the moment a person finally stops moving and lets their schedule empty out completely. Most people expect relaxation to feel light immediately, almost like a reward waiting patiently on the other side of rest. Instead, something quite different tends to happen during those first uncomfortable hours of true stillness. The fatigue, dissatisfaction, and old griefs that constant motion had buried begin slowly rising toward the surface. This is not a malfunction or a sign that something has gone wrong during a period of rest. It is simply what happens when the noise of constant doing finally stops long enough to let something else speak. Carl Jung wrote something that captures this process with striking clarity, even though he wrote it decades ago. He said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious instead. This statement applies directly to what happens the moment someone finally sits still without any task to distract them. The discomfort that arrives is not the darkness attacking a person, but the darkness finally being given room to exist. Jung called this hidden layer of the personality the shadow, the parts of ourselves we rarely allow into daily awareness. The shadow is not evil, and it does not consist only of shameful or frightening feelings. It includes ordinary things too, like unspoken exhaustion, quiet resentment, and disappointment that never had a place to be expressed. Let me tell you about someone from our community named Marcus, who wrote to us after a particularly strange weekend. He had cleared his entire schedule, expecting nothing more complicated than a pleasant, relaxing couple of days at home. Instead, by Saturday afternoon, he felt inexplicably heavy, irritable, and short-tempered with people he loved very much. Nothing bad had happened that weekend, no argument, no stressful event, nothing he could point to directly as a clear cause. He assumed at first that something was simply wrong with him, some kind of unexplained bad mood arriving without reason. Weeks later, while reflecting on this experience more calmly, Marcus realized something important about where that heaviness had actually come from. For years, he had been quietly overworking himself, taking on extra tasks, never saying no to additional responsibilities at work. He had never allowed himself to feel resentful about this pattern, because feeling resentful felt unproductive and ungrateful at the same time. The moment his schedule finally emptied, that old resentment, never named or expressed, finally had room to surface completely. It had nothing to do with his weekend at all, and everything to do with years of unspoken overextension. Marcus's story reveals a paradox that many people discover only through direct experience rather than through explanation alone. What we fear most about doing nothing, the boredom, the emptiness, the discomfort of sitting with our own thoughts, usually turns out smaller than expected once actually faced directly. We imagine that stillness will overwhelm us completely, yet most people who sit through the discomfort discover it passes within a relatively short time. The fear itself is often larger and more frightening than the actual feeling waiting quietly underneath it. This happens because avoidance, the constant motion that keeps difficult feelings pushed away, makes those feelings seem far more dangerous than they truly are. The moment someone finally faces the feeling directly, even briefly, it tends to lose much of its original intensity and power. This does not mean the process feels comfortable or pleasant while it is actually happening in real time. Sitting with unnamed exhaustion, old resentment, or quiet disappointment can feel disorienting.
Часть 4.
Especially for someone unfamiliar with this kind of stillness. Many people mistake this discomfort for depression, anxiety, or evidence that something is seriously wrong with their mental state. But Jung would suggest something different, that this discomfort is simply the shadow finally being given a chance to speak honestly. It is not trying to destroy the person experiencing it, but is instead asking quietly to be acknowledged and understood. Just like Marcus, most people discover that once the feeling is named clearly, its grip begins to loosen almost immediately afterward. The simple act of recognizing resentment, exhaustion, or disappointment removes much of the power these feelings held while they remained unnamed and hidden. If this section feels familiar to you, if you have ever felt strange or unexplained emotions surface during an empty, unplanned day, I want to know. Simply write the word "seen" in the comments below this video, so that others reading might feel less alone in this experience too. Many people carry this exact feeling quietly, believing they are the only ones who experience discomfort during rest instead of relief. Seeing this word repeated by many different viewers often brings a strange kind of comfort, proof that this experience is far more common than it feels in private. Naming a feeling publicly, even through a single small word, is itself a quiet act of making the darkness conscious. It helps to understand why this shadow material stays hidden for so long in the first place, buried beneath constant activity and endless tasks. Busy schedules function almost like a curtain, keeping certain feelings pushed far enough back that they rarely have room to surface naturally. Conversations, deadlines, responsibilities, and constant movement all work together to keep this curtain firmly in place most of the time. The moment that curtain finally lowers, during a quiet weekend or an unplanned empty afternoon, the shadow behind it becomes visible again. This is uncomfortable precisely because the curtain had been doing its job effectively for a very long time without anyone noticing. Removing it does not create new problems out of nothing, but simply reveals problems that were already quietly present the entire time. Jung believed that confronting this shadow material is never about blaming yourself or labeling yourself as somehow broken or flawed. It is instead about recognizing that every person carries both light and difficulty inside them, existing together as a complete whole. Acknowledging exhaustion does not mean a person has failed to manage their life correctly or responsibly. It simply means they are finally allowing themselves to feel something honestly that they had been managing through constant distraction instead. This shift, uncomfortable as it feels initially, tends to create more genuine relief than continuing to avoid the feeling ever could. Avoidance postpones discomfort temporarily, but rarely removes it permanently, since the feeling simply waits quietly for the next available opportunity. Think of this process like entering a dark room after spending hours outside in bright daylight without any warning beforehand. At first, nothing is visible at all, and the darkness itself feels vaguely threatening simply because it cannot be clearly seen. But as your eyes slowly adjust to the lack of light, shapes begin appearing, furniture becomes visible, and the room stops feeling unfamiliar or frightening. The shadow works in a remarkably similar way, appearing dangerous mainly because it has never been given the chance to be seen clearly. Once seen, even partially, it becomes something a person can understand and work with, rather than something to fear blindly. This is precisely why doing nothing carries more psychological weight than most people initially assume when they picture stillness. It is not simply the absence of activity, but an invitation for buried material to finally surface and be acknowledged honestly. Once the shadow work begins, even in small, uncomfortable moments like the one Marcus experienced that weekend, something shifts internally.
Часть 5.
The constant noise that once needed feeding through endless tasks starts quieting down, if only slightly afterward. And in that quieter space, something else becomes possible, something that constant noise had been drowning out for a very long time. A different kind of voice, quieter and less certain of itself than the shadow, begins waiting patiently for its own turn to be heard. Thank you for staying with this video until this exact moment, especially in a world that constantly rewards speed over depth. Choosing to sit with slow, quiet content like this is itself a small act of resistance against constant urgency. If something in these words has touched you personally, even in a way you cannot fully explain yet, consider subscribing so we can continue this journey together. Carl Jung viewed intuition as a real psychological function, equal in importance to thinking, feeling, and sensing directly through the body. It is not a vague guess or an unfounded hunch, but a legitimate way the mind processes deeper patterns. Intuition speaks quietly, and it cannot compete with the constant noise of scheduling, deciding, and reacting throughout a busy day. When someone must constantly plan, respond, and analyze, their mind naturally prioritizes fast logical thinking over slower internal signals. Intuition does not disappear during these busy periods, but it becomes starved of the space it needs to be heard clearly. Jung once wrote that intuition does not grasp at outer facts, but is instead concerned with the deeper meaning of events themselves. For that inner meaning to become audible, a person needs quiet, uninterrupted space away from constant obligations and expectations. Doing nothing provides exactly this kind of space, free from the pressure to explain, justify, or immediately act on every thought. Think about a moment many people recognize instantly once it is described clearly and simply. Someone struggles for weeks with a difficult decision, filling pages with pros and cons that never quite settle the question. Then, during an unstructured hour with no phone nearby and no task waiting, clarity arrives on its own. This happens because the mind continues working quietly in the background, even when a person is not actively trying to solve anything. Modern research on rest and creativity supports this pattern, showing that insight often appears during idle moments rather than focused effort. The busy, effortful mind gathers information, but the quiet, resting mind is often what actually connects the pieces meaningfully. Picture intuition as a soft voice sitting in a room filled with loud, overlapping conversation happening all at once. No matter how important that voice might be, it simply cannot be heard while everything around it continues talking over it. Only when the room grows quiet does that voice finally have a real chance to be noticed and understood. Doing nothing is not the absence of thought, but the deliberate creation of silence needed for that quieter voice to speak. But intuition needs more than silence alone to remain present and useful over time in daily life. It also needs energy, since even quiet inner signals require some reserve of attention and psychological presence to sustain them. If all of a person's energy continues flowing outward toward tasks, roles, and constant responsiveness, even the clearest inner voice eventually gets drowned out again. This brings us to something doing nothing restores directly, the deeper reserve of energy a person needs to keep listening. Carl Jung described psychological energy, sometimes called libido in his work, as a limited resource that fuels everything a person does throughout the day. Every action, every response, every effort to maintain an image draws from this same internal reserve, even when the effort feels small or unnoticed. Constant output, constant self-improvement, and constant motion all quietly spend this energy outward, often without a person even realizing it is happening. Over time, this steady outward flow leaves very little energy available for the quieter parts of the mind to function properly.
Часть 6.
Jung once warned that every form of addiction carries risk, whether the substance involved is alcohol, morphine, or something as seemingly harmless as an ideal. This warning extends naturally to addiction toward constant output, constant productivity, and constant self-optimization in daily life. These patterns rarely look dangerous from the outside, since they are often praised as discipline, ambition, or admirable personal growth. Yet they drain the same internal reserve, slowly and quietly, the same way any other addictive pattern eventually does. Let me share a story from someone in our community named Priya, who wrote to us about a realization she had recently. She noticed that even her hobbies had quietly turned into obligations, each one measured, tracked, and expected to produce some visible result. Every walk needed to reach a certain step count before it counted as worthwhile exercise for the day. Every book needed to be finished completely and reviewed afterward, or the time spent reading felt somehow wasted. Priya realized she had not experienced true rest in years, because even her relaxation had become another quiet form of performance. Nothing in her life offered a real chance for her internal energy to simply recover without expectation attached to it. Think of this pattern like a phone battery that never gets placed on its charger, because it is always being used for one more useful task. The battery does not fail immediately, but it slowly loses its ability to hold a full charge over time. The mind works in a strikingly similar way when it never receives a genuine period of rest without productivity attached. Doing nothing without tracking or measuring anything, is the only way this internal battery gets to recharge properly. I want to ask you something honestly, the same way Priya was honest with herself during her own realization. Has there ever been a day when you wanted to do absolutely nothing, not from sadness, but from pure depletion? If this feels familiar, consider sharing that moment in the comments below this video, so others reading might feel less alone in recognizing it too. Once energy is genuinely reclaimed through real stillness, without tasks, tracking, or hidden expectations attached, something important becomes possible. A person finally has enough internal reserve available to understand themselves more clearly, arriving closer to who they truly are underneath constant performance. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and this single sentence carries far more weight than it first appears to hold. Most people hear this idea and immediately imagine some dramatic transformation, a bold decision, a complete reinvention of their life from the outside in. But Jung never described individuation this way in his actual writing, and the truth of becoming yourself is far quieter than most people expect. It rarely arrives through grand gestures or sudden breakthroughs announced clearly to the rest of the world. Instead, it arrives through small, unremarkable moments, often moments that look like nothing at all from the outside. A quiet afternoon with nothing scheduled, an evening spent doing absolutely nothing productive, a morning with no plan and no urgency attached to it. These moments rarely feel significant while they are happening, yet they are often exactly where real internal change quietly begins to take root. To understand why doing nothing connects so directly to becoming yourself, it helps to look closely at what Jung meant by individuation in the first place. Individuation, in Jung's own words, is the process by which a person gradually separates from unconscious identification with the collective around them. This does not mean rejecting society, isolating completely, or refusing to participate in shared life with other people. It means something quieter and more internal, a slow loosening of the grip that outside expectations hold over a person's sense of identity. Most people spend years building their identity almost entirely around what others expect them to become,
Часть 7.
without ever questioning where those expectations originally came from. They chase achievements because achievement was praised early in life. They measure their worth constantly because measuring was rewarded consistently by people around them. This pattern feels completely natural, since it developed slowly, quietly, over many years of repeated reinforcement from family, school, and wider culture. Because it feels so natural, most people rarely notice it is happening until something interrupts the pattern directly and unexpectedly. Doing nothing is one of the few experiences powerful enough to interrupt this pattern in a way that cannot be avoided completely. When a person removes every task, every goal, every measurable outcome from their day, something surprising tends to happen almost immediately. Without anything to achieve, without any role to perform, a strange and uncomfortable question quietly begins to surface on its own. If I do not need to accomplish anything right now, who exactly am I in this moment? This question rarely arrives with words attached to it clearly, but instead as a vague, uneasy feeling that something essential has gone missing temporarily. Most people rush immediately to fill this uneasy feeling with another task, another distraction, another small goal to quiet the discomfort quickly. But if the discomfort is allowed to remain a little longer, without immediately reaching for something to fix it, something else begins to happen instead. Jung believed that individuation always requires a form of separation, though this separation looks nothing like physically leaving people or places behind. It is a separation from blind identification with expectation, from the automatic assumption that worth must always be earned through visible effort. This kind of separation rarely happens while surrounded by noise, obligation, and constant demands for attention and performance. It requires silence, and it requires a space where no one is watching closely enough to expect anything specific from a person. Doing nothing creates exactly this kind of space, not because stillness itself contains any special magic, but because it removes every external reference point a person normally relies on. Without a task defining the moment, without a role requiring maintenance, a person is left alone with something far more difficult to describe clearly. They are left with themselves, without decoration, without performance, without any external proof of value attached to the moment. This experience appears throughout many old stories and myths from cultures across the world, long before modern psychology gave it a formal name. Consider the widespread pattern found in stories where a central figure must withdraw completely from ordinary life before any real transformation becomes possible. In many traditions, a person enters a desert alone, carrying nothing, expected to accomplish nothing, surrounded only by silence and empty space. They are not sent there to learn a new skill, complete a task, or prove their strength through some visible accomplishment. They are sent there specifically to be stripped of every role, every title, every external marker of identity they previously relied upon. Only after this period of complete withdrawal does the story allow them to return, changed, though nothing about their outward circumstances necessarily improved during the process. What changed was internal, quiet, and largely invisible to anyone observing them from the outside during that period. This pattern repeats itself so consistently across unrelated cultures and time periods that it suggests something deeply true about human psychological development itself. The desert, the empty space, the period of doing nothing external, is not a punishment or a gap to be filled quickly. It is the necessary condition for something deeper to finally have room to emerge without interference from constant outside noise. Modern life rarely offers this kind of complete withdrawal, since almost every moment now comes filled with notifications, obligations, and constant low-level demands for attention. This makes doing nothing,
Часть 8.
even for a single afternoon, feel unusually significant in a way it likely never felt for people living generations earlier. When someone today chooses genuine stillness without a phone nearby, without a task waiting, without any plan to optimize the experience somehow, they are recreating something ancient. They are stepping briefly into that same empty desert space that old stories describe so consistently across so many unrelated traditions. And within that space, The same quiet process becomes possible now that those old stories once described symbolically through myth and metaphor. What actually happens during this quiet withdrawal is rarely dramatic, and it almost never looks impressive from the outside to anyone watching. A person notices, perhaps for the first time in years, that they feel a strange heaviness whenever they think about a certain choice they made long ago. They notice an unexpected lightness when imagining a different path, one they dismissed years earlier without ever really considering it seriously. They notice a persistent sadness with no clear cause attached to it, or an unexplained pull toward silence rather than continued explanation. These small internal signals are easy to overlook entirely when life moves quickly, filled with tasks, deadlines, and constant forward motion. But they become clear, sometimes startlingly clear, the moment external movement finally slows down enough for internal signals to be noticed properly. Jung described this inward movement as far more important than any outward journey a person might otherwise take toward some external goal. He believed that individuation is not a journey upward toward achievement, but a journey inward toward contradictions that have never been named clearly. This inward journey often reveals things that a person spent years avoiding without ever fully realizing they were avoiding them at all. Perhaps they discover a quiet dissatisfaction with a career path chosen years earlier for reasons that no longer feel true today. Perhaps they discover a forgotten interest, something they loved deeply as a child but abandoned because it seemed impractical or unserious to pursue further. Perhaps they simply discover exhaustion, plain and simple, exhaustion they had been managing successfully through constant distraction for far too long already. None of these discoveries require immediate action or a dramatic life change announced publicly to everyone around them right away. They simply require acknowledgement, the quiet, honest recognition that something real exists beneath the surface of constant performance and productivity. This acknowledgement alone, even without any immediate external change following it, often creates a noticeable shift in how a person experiences their own life afterward. There is an important paradox worth understanding clearly here, one that becomes visible only through direct experience rather than through explanation alone. The more deeply a person understands themselves through moments of genuine stillness, the less they feel compelled to constantly prove themselves to others around them. They stop rushing to explain every decision, stop reacting defensively to every piece of feedback, stop fearing every possible misunderstanding from people around them. This shift does not happen because they have risen above other people or no longer care what anyone thinks of them at all. It happens because they have found something more stable within themselves, something that no longer depends entirely on outside approval to feel secure. This inner stability is exactly what individuation ultimately produces, not perfection, not constant happiness, but a quieter, steadier relationship with one's own identity. A person still faces challenges, still experiences difficult emotions, still makes mistakes exactly like everyone else living through an ordinary life. What changes is the foundation underneath these experiences, a foundation built through genuine self-understanding rather than constant external validation and performance. It is worth returning briefly to something mentioned earlier in this video.
Часть 9.
The idea that doing nothing is often mistaken for weakness, laziness, or a lack of ambition entirely. By now, hopefully, this idea feels less convincing than it did at the very beginning of this exploration together. Doing nothing, understood through everything explored across this video, is not the opposite of growth or personal development in any meaningful sense. It is instead one of the necessary conditions that makes real growth possible in the first place, though it rarely looks impressive from the outside. The productivity mask comes off, revealing exhaustion and old feelings that busyness had quietly buried for years without acknowledgement. That exhaustion, once faced directly rather than avoided constantly, gives way slowly to a quieter internal voice known as intuition. That intuition, once given enough energy through genuine rest, becomes strong enough to guide meaningful decisions with real clarity attached to them. And underneath all of this, patiently waiting the entire time, sits the deeper process of individuation, the slow, quiet return to one's true self. None of these steps require dramatic action, special training, or any particular skill that most people do not already naturally possess. They require only permission, the simple, difficult permission to stop occasionally without guilt, without justification, without needing to prove the stillness was somehow worthwhile afterward. This permission is harder to grant yourself than it initially sounds, especially within a culture that constantly rewards visible output over quiet internal development. But every person who has genuinely tried this, who has sat through the discomfort long enough to reach whatever waits quietly on the other side, tends to describe something similar afterward. They describe feeling steadier, not because their external circumstances necessarily improved, but because their relationship with themselves finally deepened in a lasting way. Doing nothing, in the end, does not remove a person from their life or disconnect them from the people and responsibilities around them. It returns them to their life, but returns them steadier, more grounded, and more genuinely present than constant motion ever allowed them to be before. If anything in this video resonated with you personally, even in a way you cannot fully put into clear words yet, consider taking a moment right now. Like this video, if any part of it felt true to your own experience with constant busyness or quiet exhaustion. Subscribe if you would like to continue exploring these ideas together in future videos exploring Jung's psychology further. And if you have ever experienced a moment of doing absolutely nothing that led you toward unexpected clarity about yourself, share that story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, proof that they are not alone in this quiet, difficult, deeply human process of becoming who they truly are.